What's good, Kanekis? Welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing well. I'm joined today by a very, very special guest. It is Dr. Mark Thornton from the Mises Institute. He's a senior fellow there. And he also has a podcast that he does called Minor Issues. He has featured on a number of very popular mainstream outlets such as Bloomberg, The Economist, Wall Street Journal, and Forbes. And he is joining us today giving us an hour of his time to shed some light on geopolitics and the current economy. So, Dr. Mark Thornton, thank you very much for joining us today.
Kojo, I'm very happy to be here with you this morning and your audience too, of course.
Yeah, we're really honored. To start us off, I think it would be very useful if you could give the audience an overview of the Mises Institute and what it stands for.
Well, I work at the Mises Institute in Auburn, and I've been with them almost from the very beginning. So I'm very old. And the Mises the Mises Institute is a nonprofit organization, and it's an educational organization named after the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises. And of course, the main purpose is to educate people about Austrian economics and that great tradition of, Mises and F.A. Hayek and Murray Rothbard, all of the newer Austrian economists and the up and coming Austrian economists, and really to get the word out about the Austrian school. So we're not a political organization. We're not a lobbying group. So there's a lot of things that we're not. And but our mission is to teach and to preserve the Austrian school and to extend the Austrian school in new directions. And I'm very excited about, the influence that we've had in terms of getting into people's minds, important people, young people especially. I think we're having a great impact on younger adults who are, let's say, smarter than average, and they're more aggressive in terms of what they want to do with their lives and be entrepreneurs and things of that nature. And I get to see that in all of our programs because we're not just, an internet organization with 4 or 5 podcasts. I mean, we have academic journals, we have events here at the Mises Institute and other places around the world. And the influence that we've had is, at one point it was just really in the United States, but the interest on the part of younger people, especially from other places around the globe, has just been fantastic. So, and Austrian economics is very, it's a minority. It's a very teeny minority of the economics profession and, Wall Street economist and government economist, academia, that kind of thing. But we're growing very fast, and we're very, very popular online with in social media and that sort of thing.
I mean, you say it's aimed to influence the young people. I'm 26 and I've been influenced by your work and the Mises Institute. I mean, I've read books by Murray Rothbard, What Has Government Done to Our Money? Completely changed my view around currencies and what what fiat currencies are doing to society, which is something we'll touch on later in this podcast. Um, Speaking of currencies, I wanted to I know gold is money, but I wanted to discuss the price of gold currently because we've seen a crater, even though there's an ongoing war in the Middle East, governments are still printing, but it is currently trading as though, the the Federal Reserve is going to hike interest rates, the government's going to stop printing currency. So do you know why the prices suddenly tumbled so rapidly, even though the stock market is more or less at all-time highs, the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq.
Yeah, I've got a pretty good idea. In general, I say that gold is like a canary in the coal mine, which is an old saying. They used to put canaries down in coal mines. So if there was any dangerous invisible gas that was leaking into the coal mine and kills the canary first, and everybody gets out of the coal mine. Well, that's what's happening to gold. The governments have gotten out of control. They're inflating, they're borrowing, they're spending, they're exploding the government debt markets. So it's a warning sign. Um, and it's also like a fire extinguisher in the sense that when the government is doing those kind of bad things, people who own gold and silver have something to protect themselves and to put out their little personal emergencies with all the chaos that government's creating. And so, in the last several years, as we've moved into this protectionist and sort of pre-war scenario around the globe with the U.S. and China and Russia, all these political elite groups warring with each other at different levels, and of course Israel. That's a problem. But gold has responded. The price has gone way up. Late last year and early this year, of course, the market really got explosive going higher. I mean, it went vertical for all intents and purposes. And then that continued through January, and then everything fell apart. Now, part of that, the early downturn in gold, I think, was just the result of all the speculation and the traders and the hedge funds, the computerized trading, getting into the market and then leaving the market, and hedge funds and so forth, getting into the market and then needing liquidity for emerging problems in things like private equity, private credit, and they were moving, really starting to move from things like gold and silver into other commodities, which is very typical in these inflationary trends. They'll move into oil and other metals and, trying to sniff out new profit opportunities. So we got that initial big downturn in the economy that coincided with President Trump nominating Kevin Warsh to the Federal Reserve chairman. And Warsh had this reputation for being, tough on interest rates and the money supply. And so all of that sort of coincided to drive the markets back lower down to the upward trend line that was established in the marketplace. And just as the market got its footing, of course, Israel attacked Iran, and the United States was, quote, forced to join in on killing, the Ayatollah and the leadership of Iran when they were supposedly meeting to work out some peace negotiations. So, that obviously is going to have a short-term effect on the market. Isolated wars like this are terrible. It's really bad for the economy, but overall, it may be temporary, and it may pass. Hopefully that peace will be restored, markets will be restored. But it's very interesting that you bring up this question, because what happens is that when the war over there heats up and the oil industry is under attack and commerce is prevented by blocking the Strait of Hormuz, and oil prices spike higher, everybody was anticipating gold going up much higher as a result of that. But
Yeah.
The really important thing, because gold prices are driven by monetary inflation, that higher oil prices mean that the CPI statistic is going to jump higher. And the Fed is supposed to be using uh, consumer price index statistics to guide its policy. And so if that CPI and their other proprietary measures of consumer prices spikes higher, that prevents them from cutting interest rates. It doesn't.
Yeah.
It just doesn't give them political cover for cutting interest rates. They'll eventually cut interest rates no matter what. But almost overnight, we saw the market expecting 2 or 3 or more rate cuts, especially before the war nomination, to all of a sudden, with oil prices spiking, no rate cuts whatsoever. And in the short run, gold and silver depend on low interest rates. In the long run, it doesn't really matter as much, but in the short run, interest rate direction does affect the price of gold and silver because, of course, gold and silver don't earn anything. So as interest rates go up, the big traders feel like their money is better earning some kind of interest somewhere in government bonds and so forth. And so we had this dynamic going on, and we still do, actually, that if the war heats up, oil prices go up, and gold and silver prices go down. But that really fits the mold. Everybody is following the Fed's playbook. And it's not just the Fed, too. It's all central banks. This is
They're all interconnected.
yeah, they're all interconnected, and they all, said, well, we can't cut rates now. And some central banks actually talked about raising interest rates.
Isn't that the Australian central bank? I believe it was.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Because they were
So,
already kind of overheating, as they say
yeah.
in Fed lingo.
I mean, what does it even mean of a heating economy? But yeah, you touched on something very interesting about, oh, if interest rates go higher, it's like an opportunity cost. That's what they always say when you hold gold in such an environment. But that assumes that people would want to buy the bonds and treasuries of these countries because we know they're heavily indebted and they will have to print to make up the difference. So in emerging markets, we see that sometimes the interest rates on these currencies can go up, but no one buys them in the end because they don't want it. So isn't that a fundamental assumption that we're making, that people will end up buying the treasuries and the bonds? Because what if they don't?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are moving away from government long-term dated government bonds. And
Yeah,
I think that trend is firmly established. So over the long run, people have already said, we don't want US government bonds. We don't want other bonds. We don't, the Chinese don't want the US government bonds, the Russians, of course,
mm,
in other countries around the world. But in the short term, all of this big money on Wall Street, I mean, they're flipping that money, from one category to another. So they can easily move in and out of these assets the way you and I can't.
mm,
So my long-term view on government bonds is decidedly negative, but the people who control vast sums of money and are big players in these government bond markets and all markets really, they're the ones that flooded into gold and silver in November and
yeah,
December, especially after the Fed. They did a double take where they said, we're not going to be um, quantitative tightening anymore. And then just a little while later, they said, well, we've got to buy government bonds anyways because of
I remember that.
liquidity. And that really supercharged gold and silver there in December and January. But yeah, I mean, the long-term trend is definitely away from government bonds, and I think into emerging markets. Really, I see emerging markets, in Africa and South America and in Asia as the place to go in the future.
Any
And
countries in
right,
particular?
what's
I know
that?
Brazil. Any of these emerging markets? Which countries in particular? I know Brazil is a major one in South America, but I'm wondering about the African ones.
Yeah, well, I mean the the Brazilian one is high on my list, and all of the commodity countries, the countries that produce a lot of basic raw materials and commodities, I think are probably the best served, along with um, developed countries like Australia and Canada that have a lot of commodities. But Brazil is probably a primary example because it is an emerging market and it has lots of gold and oil and agricultural products.
Yeah,
Now, the African access to investment in African investments is a little more difficult. They don't have a lot of well-developed ETFs.
yeah,
There's more political instability, so you have that to deal with. Um, and of course, all emerging markets have political instability, including Brazil. Um, so, and of course, I'm not an investment advisor or counselor, but I think that, for a young audience, um, commodities and emerging markets, and of course, China is an emerging market as well, but they're a commodity consumer, not a producer, net producer, but
okay,
they handle things in terms of like manufacturing and technology and higher order goods like automobiles and electronics. So there is a wide variety of things to choose from within emerging markets, and there's a whole risk profile too. Um, I made an investment in Africa, and it's a commodity investment, not a big one, and but there's a lot of political risk, jurisdiction risk, but of course there's a trade-off there. So political risk, if it's high, the rate of return, of course, is also going to be potentially very high as
hi,
well.
yeah, yeah. You know, Rick Rule. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He talks about buying hate, and he particularly likes investing in countries where, political instability is factored into the price because he can take advantage of any discrepancies in price and value.
Oh yeah,
So
I'm very familiar with Mr. Rule and a big fan of his mind.
yeah,
You know, he's one of the great ambassadors for investing in commodities, and he's one of the great teachers as
yeah,
well.
yeah,
And if you see enough of his videos, you'll realize that he has a libertarian political philosophy like we do. And
mm-hmm,
he'll also sometimes, if you listen to enough of him, or if you get a chance to ask him a question, Ludwig von Mises's uh, magnum opus, or his treatise, Human Action, a treatise on economics, which was originally published in 1949, Rick Rule will refer to that book as
yeah.
being very important in his own outlook on things. So, yes, and I hope to meet him someday as well.
Yeah, he's a great character. I've had him on the channel a few times.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
great.
just an incredible character.
Yes, he is.
I mean, honestly, you're an interviewer's dream because you're touching on lots of points that I've put down. So
That
you
means you have to.
mentioned,
That means you have to have me back on at some point.
oh, for sure, for sure. So the next point to build on what you talked about, libertarian approaches. This is going to be an interesting one. How much control over the economy should governments ideally have? The economy, society, how much control over our lives should they have?
Well, the basic question: how much control should the government have over the economy? They should have no control over the economy, or
Why is
certainly
that?
as little as possible. And I
Okay.
think that a lot of mainstream economists the better mainstream economists tend to agree with the Austrians about that approach, is that there shouldn't be, any regulations, there shouldn't be any price controls, that you shouldn't be taxing productive efforts like labor, investment,
Hmm.
um, income, and that sort of thing. So mainstream economists, the better ones, I mean, the ones that aren't socialists, they all agree that the free market is a good thing, but then they always have but this and but that,
Yeah.
and they want to butt Insky into everything in the economy. It turns out, but we see it as harmful. All of those interventions are harmful. We have, tons of lectures on all that stuff, but we also see it as completely unnecessary. That the market process, people are so worried about, the market run amok, without any controls. But basically, free markets are very well regulated. They have their own regulatory features to them. Competition is the best regulating force in the economy. Consumers and consumer sovereignty over markets is the best check on bad business practices.
Yeah.
And we know that consumers are not dupes. We know that they can be taken in by business, but it's usually in those industries that are hyper regulated, where the government says, we'll take control of this and we'll protect you, like with banking. Banking is one of the biggest, highly regulated industries in the United States and really in the world,
Hmm.
where the federal regulators, the Fed, the Treasury, state regulators, everybody's in there, with their microscopes, analyzing what the bankers are doing. And yet, still, every few years, we end up in a crisis where, oh, the regulators didn't catch this or they didn't catch that,
They didn't do enough.
and then they need a whole big commission and a book this big of new
Hmm.
regulations. And
Hmm.
let's face it, they have failed over and over again. And But competition works extremely well to serve consumers. Consumers are very adept. They have all sorts of means, especially nowadays. We know that there's when we go online shopping, there's reviews, there's ratings, um, and that, of course, there's all sorts of new sorts of scams, and we
Hmm.
have to adapt to various scams that come into the market. But the government doesn't prevent those either. The things where they're supposed to be, like on the telephone, on your cell phone, and that sort of stuff. They regulate that stuff to death, and yet
Hmm.
they can't prevent spam. They can't prevent, manipulation of customers. So they claim to be protecting people, but they don't actually do it, and they very often they just provide sort of a protective cover that makes consumers let their guard down and gives a bigger approach for these scammers to get into the marketplace. So we see no need for the government in markets, and they don't help consumers, and all of these government interventions lead to monopoly power in markets, because once you start regulating, once you start taxing, and every little mom and pop has to comply with all these regulations, it puts the small business at a disadvantage and puts big business at an advantage, because they've got accountants and lawyers and so on and so forth that mom and pops don't have. And as a result, it's very difficult for new competitors to get into these markets, and it allows the existing competitors more power in these markets. And so they're able to raise their prices somewhat.
Yeah.
They're able to reduce their quality somewhat, reduce their service somewhat, and consumers are less served. And then you get the incumbent firms lobbying government for even more protection. So it's very much a lose, lose, lose proposition in terms of government intervention in the economy.
Yeah. And the funny thing is the governments will then say the corporations who have the monopolies are price gouging and they need to split them apart. But we know that everything they do more or less has the opposite effects, like all the acts they have, the Affordability Act. In the UK, it's like, honestly, I can't remember who said it in the podcast, but the person said whatever acts the government does, just take the opposite of it, because that's what's going to happen. In the UK,
that's a great starting point.
Yeah, in the UK, they recently had this renters' rights, where a renter, so in the UK, you could have fixed contract agreements with your landlord, where the contract put in change for a year, and you could lock in your rent. But now they said, nah, that's giving the landlords too much power. So there's no longer such a thing as fixed rent. But the renter can give the landlord a 2 month notice, so they can leave at any time. And I thought about it initially. I was like, okay, fine. But then knowing what I know about, Austrian economics, I'm like, well, wouldn't the landlords just end up increasing the price because they need to cover that risk of the renter and who ends up leaving? And then, they can't plan for the future because they don't have that fixed income coming every month. Before, they could be surprised 1 month and hear, oh, after 2 months, you'll no longer have this income you've been having. So it's going to end up, reducing the available rooms for rents. And I'm just trying to get people to understand that the governments aren't on our side, even though it might seem like they are.
Oh yeah, they give consumers, perceived benefits.
Yeah.
But, things like longer term contracting give the consumer a way of budgeting, for a longer period of time.
Exactly.
And by reducing the risk to landlords, and entrepreneurs, they're managing risk. So the contract allows a reduction in risk. And therefore, what we would expect to see is a somewhat lower price for the rent. Whereas if the landlord, where everybody could come and go as they please, well, how are they supposed to budget? So you're allowing both sides to budget. You're reducing the risk on both sides of the transaction, and you're reducing transactions cost and lowering the prices, really, and increasing the benefits for both sides. And, I said, when you said whatever the government says it is, it's probably the opposite.
The opposite,
and,
yeah.
And that's very true. That's a good working assumption. But what we do here is, we we don't, we're not just a cheerleader group that says government's bad, market's
Hmm.
good. We're here to actually teach how markets work, why markets work, why government doesn't work, why it always fails, why do the worst always get to the top. So we're doing teaching the mechanics
First
of these
principles.
things. And, in a lot of our programs, it's not like you're taking a college course. You're just being exposed, and you're not sitting down and memorizing, theories and graphs and so forth. But at least that there is a mechanism, you know,
Hmm.
as to why competition forces up wage rates and why competition forces prices to their most efficient levels and those kind of issues that otherwise we're thinking, well, how does that work, And
Hmm.
so the socialists use that weakness in our thinking to bring up, hypotheticals. And then all of a sudden, like we're not sure, we don't know how that works. Um, and responding, with a cheerleading phrase, markets work, governments don't, is not going to win the argument. So we're here to show people that there are arguments that you can see, that you personally can understand and relate to, and if necessary, you can go look them up.
Yeah, yeah. It is all empirical. It's all evidence based, looking at the past, what has happened over time. Like I said, just taking people through first principles, because it's like people need to understand why things are the way they are, as opposed to just telling them this is it and believe it, which is what tends to happen with, MMT socialist circles. But we're not calling any names. I mean, to each their own, but it just seems to me like Austrian economics is just about common sense. Just look at what has happened in the past and then work from there. Um, now, I think the main topic that I like to discuss, actually, because I've talked about it on my channel a few times, but it's something that's really close to my heart, is about the effects of fiat currencies on society. In your research, what have you found to be the main effects? How does fiat currencies alter, society's morals? And yeah, just tell us more about that.
Well, that's near and dear to my heart. That was near and dear uh, to Ludwig von Mises for sure, and F.A. Hayek and Murray Rothbard. I mean, they all wrote a great deal um, about this. And
Hmm.
I actually did a podcast a couple of months ago where I looked at the 7 deadly economic sins in society. So I looked at, these 7 things, which I think most people agree are the 7 worst things that uh, exist in our modern economy. And I tie them all to fiat currency. And so, paper money, the
Hmm.
whole purpose of that is to allow the government to debase the paper money. I don't care what they say, but their goal is to be able to print up more money to spend on themselves.
Hmm.
But money is so important; it permeates everything in the economy. It's ubiquitous, and it has macroeconomic effects. In other words, some dental regulation is going to affect people's teeth, and it's only going to affect a few people in the economy. But money is everywhere. Money is macro. It's ubiquitous. Everybody knows it causes higher prices, but it also causes the business cycle, and it also causes a redistribution of wealth and income in society away from the working class to the very wealthy and to government itself. And I wrote a whole book on this subject called The Skyscraper Curse. And I go through those, particularly the business cycle, but also the redistribution of income and wealth in society, where the working class is made poorer while the uber wealthy, especially the political elites that are connected both to big business and, well, you can kind of think of like what they refer to, where some people refer to today as the Epstein class. They're made very wealthy as a result of printing money and artificially low interest rates. So it undermines savings and wealth accumulation across society. It undermines family formation. So people getting together to form families, getting married, establishing households. And we all know that now, people get married much, much later, or they don't get married at all. They have fewer kids, and then there's more divorce and separation and all of that. So it's hard to connect, the printing press in Washington, D.C. and its central banks around the world with these social problems. But actually, one of our summer research fellows, Jeffrey Dagner, who's now a dean of business where he teaches, he did some research here for his PhD, and he just published this book, which addresses exactly those issues, inflation and the family. So it undermines social institutions. It undermines moral character, in the sense that, low interest rates and inflation and a lack of savings really warp people's minds away from, personal growth and enrichment, and more towards what, they have what we call high time preferences. So they want everything right now. They want to consume, they want to be satisfied. They want to satisfy their more basic animalistic wants and desires, and they are less interested in long-term human enrichment and development and personal character and moral character and all of those kind of things. And of course, all of that undermines social stability, because families, everybody agrees, even the socialists sometimes agree that, the family is the source of social stability. If you undermine the family, and this is where the Marxists, of course, they actively want to undermine the family and increase social instability so that the state becomes more powerful in society and more in control and can manipulate people's minds.
The state schools then.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. And state schools feeds into that. So, this printing press, where a lot of, people are obviously concerned with higher prices. And that's the most visible and direct effect. But it really permeates society by raising people's time preferences, wanting things now and not concerned about the future. And that leads to really a degeneration of the individual and society. I believe, and I've been talking about this a lot because it makes sense to everybody, and that is that all good things in this world come from the bottom up. The individual, the family, the household, small businesses, community. And, a lot of people agree with that. And nothing good comes from the top down.
Top down. Because
You know,
then it's being imposed on you as opposed to it coming from among you and around you.
that's right. Yeah, it's being imposed, and it's one size fits all. You know,
Yeah.
the top down solution is always one size fits all. It never works out. And it usually is very disruptive or maybe even destructive.
Hmm.
So that's where I go with, I take that fiat money, and I've learned, of course, all of this from other writers, going back into antiquity, but certainly all modern Austrian economists are very interested in this. And most mainstream economists just stick with money seems to raise higher prices, but not what prices or who benefits and who loses. They just look at the consumer price index and
Yeah.
assume that everything else is a wash, and that it doesn't have any distributive effects or destructive effects. But the Austrians don't believe that. We believe that it does have disruptive effects and destructive effects. And Jeff Degner has, shown that, I think, very clearly, drawing on these lessons and modern statistics.
You've touched on everything I wanted to talk about regarding the harmful effects, especially the family create formation. Um, there's this website called WTF happened in 1971. I don't know if you've seen that website.
I don't think I have.
Oh, it's a website of lots of charts that talk about what happened to society in 1971. You know, when Nixon depegged the dollar from gold, and you see this sudden changes in the price of a house, divorce rates, education levels. So maths and science scores plummeting since 1971. School shootings increasing massively since 1971. This just is like if once you see it, you can't unsee it because the correlation is just too close. It's too close to not be rooted in that. And one of the things you didn't mention though was wars, ongoing wars, because like you said, they printed again and again and again, ad infinitum, and we're seeing these forever wars now. The Ukraine-Russia war, it hasn't ended yet. Venezuela, that was a quick one, but now we're seeing the Middle East again. And in the past, when it was tied to gold, the wars only lasted as long as the treasury had gold. But now, because they can print it forever, they have no reason not to keep it going, because the more it keeps going, they get a cut of it, and it just incentivizes more killing, more wars. And it's the thing that really gets to me. It really, really does get to me. So it's why I advocate for sound money, just so we can see an end to all the mass killing.
Yeah, Mises argued that sound money was important as a check on war, big government, and outrageous new government programs. So we realize that the gold standard is a check on really bad government behavior, including war, especially. And I think what we see through history is that various forms of socialism and the decline in free market liberalism at the end of the 20th century, in the beginning of the 21st century, the breakdown of that old free market liberal regime that brought us massive increases in the standard of living and population, and just the world, the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
And then socialism, Marxism, fascism, all of that came into play. And we had World War I and World War II, when all of the major countries were either fascist, communist, or socialist. And then, after World War I and World War II, we had the Cold War, which was a non-active war, but government was able to extract so much money and power from it that they didn't need to be actively killing so many people.
Yeah.
But more recently, there's been a rise of protectionism, a rise of trading bloc countries, and a lack or destruction of international cooperation. And it's not political cooperation, but it's the breakdown of cooperation between countries, which really was quite good and extensive after World War II. There was more trade. The US dollar, was relatively stable and served as a trading currency and a reserve currency, and up until 1971, everything kind of mimicked the gold standard. And so there was much less fighting. But unfortunately, I think we're on an upward trajectory of more socialism, more protectionism, less cooperation, and more antagonism politically between countries. Very, very concerned about that. Mises and the Austrians have been very explicit that war is always and everywhere bad for the economy. It's bad for the standard of living. There's no,
Yeah. There's
World
no
War
good
II.
side.
Yeah, World War II did not get us out of the Great Depression, guys. You know, and so I'm very, very concerned. But I'm also very hopeful because in general, people are much less patriotic in the sense of, supporting their governments. They're much more anti-war. The opinion polls right now in the United States are decidedly against President Trump intervening in the Middle East. They're decidedly against Israel in general for genocide and, attacking Iran. And, those are just the the public opinion. Whereas if you go back 20 years, most Americans had a favorable view of Israel, and there was a peace process in the Middle East. And now Israel has really thrown that out, and they've embarked on this treacherous campaign to disrupt and destroy and kill, their neighbors. And they have the very unfortunate support of the United States government and its military apparatus and, the military industrial complex and the neoconservatives. It's all very, very unfortunate, and it's very, very dangerous. Right now, the war is rather isolated, but this could quickly get out of control and get China actively involved, Russia actively involved, the Middle Eastern states, and the surrounding states in the region. This drags in a lot of Asian economies, which are dependent upon Middle Eastern oil.
Yeah.
And of course, the Europeans are lost in the wilderness right now, as usual. But it's really an awful thing that needs to be stopped.
Wow. Wow. I mean, Do you know Gerard Salente? He's another
I know of
popular.
him, yes.
Yeah, so he has this very popular quote, when all else fails, they take you to war. And we've seen the general slowdown in the economy. We know that governments, they love the GDP as a metric. So when they go to war, governments have to increase spending, so GDP is artificially inflated. So we're seeing that by their own metrics, they believe war is good. They're incentivized to go to war. So I'm just wondering what we as individuals can do to play a part in, you know, bringing the gold standard back. How can we bring that about to hopefully bring an end to all this chaos?
Well, your podcast is doing it. Everybody can get on their own personal precious metals gold standards by simply stacking, regularly small amounts of gold and silver as their budget permits,
Yeah.
and be an advocate for that kind of thing within your own social groups. Learn more about it.
Mm,
Um,
certainly.
I can send you a link so that everybody that listens to your podcast can get a copy of Murray Rothbard's "What Has Government Done to Our Money," and
Money.
also
Great book.
we're
Great
giving
book.
away free copies of Hayek's greatest hits book. Some of the greatest essays are in here. Why the Worst Get to the Top. His essay, which was a inspiration for cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin. The famous essay on the use of knowledge in society, which I gave to one of my students here at Auburn University, and he used that as an inspiration to create the online encyclopedia Wikipedia. So,
Wow.
there's a
Okay.
lot of great knowledge here that everybody can learn and start transmitting to your little world around you. And over your lifetime, it's going to have a big effect. And it means you're doing something by getting on your own personal gold standard, getting more knowledgeable, being able
Hmm.
to make effective arguments for the free society, all this kind of stuff. It changes your mindset, but allows you to change other people's mindset. So
Yeah.
I can send you the link so that
Thank
all
you.
of your listeners can get free copies. I don't know if we have any free copies of Rothbard's "What Has Government Done to Our Money," but we do have a link where you can download an electronic copy. And of course, the Hayek book we do have. That's our campaign right now to give away those books, and it's really an electric, dynamic collection of Hayek's most worthwhile and insightful articles. His Nobel Prize winning lecture is in there, and just phenomenal stuff.
Yeah. I read his article, Why the Worst Get to the Top, after your recent interview, the one you posted on minor issues, and honestly blown away because I was reading 1984 at the same time. I finished the book
Uh,
yesterday, and it was like I was just reading the book again because it was literally the same thing. Now, once again, first principles, you can see it over and over again. It doesn't matter what medium it is. You just see the principle. Once the logic is there, it's universal. It really is. Dr. Mark Thornton, I will have to have you back because there are other things that were on my list that we didn't get round to. But please, could you tell the audience where they can find you?
Well, I encourage everybody to go to our webpage, which is Mises.org, Mises.org. And my personal economic podcast is called Minor Issues, Minor. We talk a lot about mining companies but this is different. You know,
Right.
this is about issues that aren't covered in the mainstream, or they're aspects of issues which aren't mentioned in the mainstream media. And so I try to bring them out and show the Austrian take on these things. And that podcast, along with other podcasts, are available on our webpage, and you can subscribe, and or it's on you. They're all on YouTube as well, and all the podcast platforms. But there's really just an unlimited supply of lectures and conferences and events and academic type stuff, and just daily articles that tell you how Austrians and libertarians think about particular issues. So, yeah, that's the best thing you can do to make things happen.
Excellent. Excellent. Dr. Thornton, thank you very much for your time. It is much appreciated.
It's been a blast.
Let's go. And there we have it, Kanekis. That is the interview with Dr. Mark Thornton. Man, what a time. What a great time. I've learned so much from him over the years. It's still surreal that I was able to sit down with him. So I enjoyed it. I hope you guys did as well. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe as well if you're new and you haven't already. Be sure to check out some of the other interviews I've done with Rick Rule, Lynette Zhang, and Francis Hunt. I'll be speaking with Rick and Lynette next month, so do be sure to look forward to that. Once again, hit the subscribe button so you can keep up with that. And also, I've done lots of other economics videos that you can find in the playlist on the channel. Thank you guys very much for your attention, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.